Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space today. And when we're in the green space, you can watch as well as listen to the program. Just go to WNYC.org or thegreenspace.org or the WNYC Facebook page for live streaming video if you want to see us here in the green space right now. This week marks 1 year since Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. As many of you remember, the weeks leading up to his confirmation and same-day swearing in were contentious for the country as allegations of sexual misconduct in Kavanaugh's youth were made public. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony and the limited scope week-long FBI investigation into what she alleged left many people with several unanswered questions, like how did Senate Republican Jeff Flake and Senate Democrat Chris Coons create bipartisan support to agree with the White House's request for a limited scope FBI investigation, and why Max Stier, who said he witnessed at Yale Kavanaugh's lewd behavior toward a female student, wasn't interviewed by the FBI when he put himself forward, and who is the real Brett Kavanaugh. These questions and much more led our next guests, New York Times reporters Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly, to write a book just out called The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, an investigation. And they are now even comparing parts of the confirmation strategy to Trump's current impeachment defense strategy, so we'll get to that. Please welcome Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly to the green space. Hi.
Thank you.
And by way of background, Robin, you went undergrad. Christopher Wiley went underground. You went undergrad at Yale with Kavanaugh and lived in the same dorm. Do you remember him, what he was like at that time? Did this influence your interest in reporting this story?
Well, I do remember him vaguely. My college roommates were varsity athletes. Brett Kavanaugh hung out with an athletic crowd, although he didn't himself make varsity basketball. He did play JV and kind of was a regular in the gym. But I was drawn into the Kavanaugh coverage for the Times a year ago, as was Kate, because of these personal connections, because I had the yearbook, which became valuable, because I had access to classmates who might shed light on his personal and professional development. And so that was the connection that drew me in.
And why call it The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, Kate?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. We thought that the title worked on a few different levels. First of all, we wanted to take a look at his education. Where was he educated? And the answer is Georgetown Prep, the Jesuit boys' school in the greater Washington area, and Yale undergrad, as well as Yale Law School. We wanted to look at his early influences, how he decided to pursue a career in the law. And of course, also look at some of these alleged incidents that occurred during his school years. The accusations of Christine Blasey Ford, Deborah Ramirez, and then there was one other incident that we reported on, all of which sort of fell during that period of time. So we wanted to try to answer some of the questions that had not been satisfactorily answered last year by the FBI, and certainly not for the public, which didn't get to see the report that the FBI did do. We also thought there was a second level of meaning, though, which is this point that we're at in our politics and our culture is just so toxic and so divisive. And even for a person like Brett Kavanaugh, who was a lifelong Washingtonian, had worked in the White House, had worked on an influential circuit court before the Supreme Court, he was a student of politics. But I think even for him and other veterans of those processes in Washington, lawyers that represented Dr. Ford, this was sort of a new low in terms of where we are, in terms of a dialogue or a lack of it, and a rancor that exists in this country.
So this additional woman, Robin, who came forward with allegations, reported for the first time in your book. Tell us about her.
Yes, this is a classmate who has a similar situation to what Deborah Ramirez alleged. What made it distinctive and worth including in our book is that we have Max Stier, who runs a good government organization in Washington, D.C. that is nonpartisan, and he alleged that he witnessed Brett Kavanaugh exposing himself to yet another classmate at another drunken party freshman year. It seemed germane because it did reinforce and echo Deborah Ramirez's experience, although the woman in question, her friends say she doesn't remember it. But everybody was drunk, which sort of sheds some light on why that might be, as well as the fact that Max Stier brought these allegations to members of the Senate as well as the FBI, and they were never pursued, which is meaningful and of a piece with a process that many felt was circumscribed and limited.
If she doesn't remember the incident in question, then with what confidence are you reporting this as an allegation of Brett Kavanaugh's behavior, Kate?
Steyer has a clear recollection of it, and we had multiple sources telling us that he had shared this with multiple Senate offices, with the FBI as well. There's a letter that has emerged from Senator Chris Coons to Chuck Grassley and other senior officials in the Senate to the FBI director saying, Max Steyer is a witness you should talk to. He has an allegation that he would like to describe to you. So we had multiple sources on that score. There was even another document that described the incident itself with the woman's name that we had from another source. So we felt that this was well-sourced in terms of raising the allegation and the claims that Steyer tried to bring.
What happened in your analysis with Steyer trying to come forward with things during the actual confirmation process, Robin, and him being stifled?
You know, our sense was that there were many people who tried to reach the FBI. Many Yale classmates, for example, had information that they felt was relevant to evaluating Judge Kavanaugh for the court in terms of his drinking, for example. Many of them went to great lengths to try to reach the FBI. Max Steyer was among them. Because he's a creature of Washington, he actually had access at a high level to many important people who had decision-making power in this process. But our sense was that this was an FBI investigation directed by the president. He was the client, and he didn't want it to kind of go out of control or become a fishing expedition. And so they made sure to keep it very limited, and they excluded much of the information that might have shed some light on other aspects of this process.
Listeners, we can take some phone calls for New York Times correspondents Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly, their new book, The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, an Investigation. Our phone number, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. And audience here in the green space, you can raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. Let's go to a call right now. We have Jack in Long Island City. Jack, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, thank you. Christine Ford testified about trying to find her memory that if somebody would locate a grocery store bagger who she knew, he might help her remember a particular date. It seemed quite pivotal at the time. It seemed like the right thing for the FBI to follow up on and find out. Fairly easy to do. What do you know about it?
Who wants it? Kate, you're nodding.
I'll take this. I believe you're talking about Mark Judge. So Mark Judge was a classmate of Brett Kavanaugh's at Georgetown Prep in high school, a good friend of Kavanaugh's at the time. And I'm sure people remember he was the person who was alleged to be in the bedroom when a young Christine Blasey was assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh, allegedly. So Mark Judge worked at a local Safeway grocery store in the area where they all lived. He writes about a job like that over the summer that Dr. Ford said was the summer in question, which was 1982. His older brother, Michael Judge, spoke to me for the book and confirmed that indeed Mark Judge did work at this Safeway in the summer of 1982. The reason this is significant is that Dr. Ford recalled running into Mark some weeks after the incident. She couldn't be sure of the exact date, and feeling that he was shamefaced to see her, to come face to face, as if to make a tacit acknowledgement that something shameful had gone down and that he was embarrassed to be seeing her. And she suggested that people locate employment records for that.
There have been some controversies surrounding the release of the book. There was a tweet apparently sent out from the Times Twitter that people felt trivialized the experience of women who've been sexually assaulted. Some feminists were mad. The president was mad and called for the resignation of everyone at the Times. Okay. Would you like to further clarify what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there were a couple things that happened. We ran an excerpt, which, unfortunately, in omitting the name of the woman who Max Steyer had witnessed, we also
which is in the book,
which
right?
is in the book. We do name her in the book. The editors often there's a tradition at the Times of protecting a victim, and so it was in that interest that he took that line out. And the line included the fact that she had told her friends she didn't remember. So the Republicans seized on that as potentially exculpatory. as if we had intended to somehow tilt that story, which we felt was unfortunate, and we did put it back in and acknowledged it in an editor's note. The tweet, I have to own, was something I drafted to do the exact opposite of trivialize her experience, but rather to validate it by saying that, many people in the course of our reporting for the book have said of someone taking his pants down at a drunken dorm party, how bad is that on the spectrum of sexual misconduct? It doesn't amount to sexual assault. It's not comparable to what Christine Blasey Ford experienced. I was trying to say, even though that may not seem bad, in the scheme of things, it can be actually very damaging and is unacceptable behavior. Unfortunately, it was worded badly, and we also apologized for that.
And Kate, what do you hope will come of the book? Some kind of serious reopening of an investigation into Brett Kavanaugh? As you know, there are people who've talked about impeaching him on the basis of your book. And there are others who say, this is maybe interesting for the record, but it's time to move on.
Right. I mean, we're hoping that people will want to read all the additional facts that we uncovered and also, importantly, the context that we uncovered from very much of a 360-degree view of Christine Blasey Ford, Deborah Ramirez, Brett Kavanaugh, the lawyers and the political figures who were involved. Just looking at it from all sides, we humbly feel that we are probably the experts on this topic just from that 360-degree perspective, because although we weren't involved ourselves, so we don't have that intimacy with certain facts, we have a broad look at all the facts. So I think for those who felt that the FBI investigation was unsatisfying, left open questions, there of course are still questions. We do not have perfect information. But we tell you who we called and what we tried to do. There's a kind of a blow-by-blow of how we looked for the house that Dr. Ford described and how we felt that we narrowed it down to a short list of 2 potential places, and other details that I think really substantiate and contextualize her claims and her recollections. And it's just unfortunate that there's a little bit of a shoot the messenger situation in our country right now, where people would rather kind of judge something prior to reading it and take an immediate stance on one side or the other, as opposed to say, look, this is complicated and there are decent people on both sides of the equation, and let's try to understand both before we make any decisions about how to move forward.
You were on the Times podcast, The Daily, this morning, and among the things you talked about there that we heard was the so-called dead chicken strategy pursued by a guy named Mike Davis, who's the chief counsel for Republican Supreme Court nominations. And he says he got the idea for the so-called dead chicken strategy from a story he heard from Clarence Thomas about growing up on a farm. So here's 18 seconds of Mike Davis from The Daily talking about that.
He said when dogs killed chickens, they would take those chickens and wrap it around those dogs' necks. And as those chickens rotted around those dogs' necks, those dogs lost the taste for chicken. And I think that's what Republicans need to start doing with the left.
I think I need to hear that a second time to understand it. But Robin, what's he getting at there? And Clarence Thomas said that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's Clarence Thomas's story or a story that Clarence Thomas had heard,
Okay.
but he did relay it to Mike Davis. And what it means is that the analogy or the metaphor is that the dead chicken are these allegedly specious allegations from Democrats that should be kind of, I'm sorry, is that right? Yes, should be wrapped around.
He's talking about his words, the smears and lies that liberals
Right.
have told about various people, including but not limited to Judge Kavanaugh.
Right, and it should be wrapped around the necks of...
Right, so the smears and lies, according to Davis, should be wrapped around the necks of liberals so that they lose the taste for smears and lies.
Right.
They reconsider their own motivations, and that pertains quite directly to the current situation with the impeachment suggestions and what should be done to defend President Trump.
Right. I mean, what's interesting is just how that's the strategy used to confirm Judge Kavanaugh is now being employed in terms of Trump, which is to kind of beat back these allegations, to talk about the process and try to delegitimize it, to talk about kind of a Democratic conspiracy rather than engage on the substance of the allegations and the degree to which there's actually substantiation for them.
And it's worth noting here, too, I mean, Davis was the senior Senate staffer kind of tasked with handling the Kavanaugh nomination. And so he both had to run a technical process on behalf of the majority, which was the GOP, of course, but he also became this unapologetic advocate for Brett Kavanaugh in the process. So he was kind of having to work along parallel tracks, wage this sort of really what amounted to a conservative culture war, while at the same time manage the technical process and try to have it seem fair.
Kavanaugh's been on the court for a year now. You wrote that Mike Davis, quote, wasn't pumped about him because Kavanaugh seemed less interested in shifting the court to the right and more in making a legacy for himself. According to the website SCOTUS blog, most of his votes have aligned with Justice Roberts, Chief Justice, but has he lived up to conservative expectations on his ruling so far?
I think the jury is out on that, so to speak. I think he's definitely being careful, as many first-term judges are. Actually, he's in his second term, which just started Monday, but to kind of keep his head down and not attract more controversy, having kind of come into this position under such a cloud and, you know, had to enter the court on his first day through a gauntlet of protesters. And at the same time, he does have a history on the D.C. circuit of pragmatism, not being a right-wing ideologue. And I think there is some hope among the left that perhaps he will be more of a Kennedy or even a Souter than he will be a Scalia or a Gorsuch. But it does remain to be seen.
To this point, let's take one more quick call. Patty on line 2 in Princeton Junction. You're on WNYC. Hi, Patty. Right to the point. We're short on time.
How is Kavanaugh likely to rule on two cases that are most certain to come before the court, Trump's tax returns and his administration's refusal to comply with Congress's request for documents?
Thank you so much for that question. Any way to tell?
I'm not sure I heard the first one clearly, but in terms of impeachment and the House's demand that Trump cooperate with their inquiry, hard to say. We don't know if this will come to the Supreme Court's attention, although there's certainly a chance of it. One thing that many people have noted from Kavanaugh's past writings is a 2009 law review article in which he argues that a sitting president can't be indicted, and it seems to indicate a sense of strong executive powers. However, that was 10 years ago. We'll see how it plays out.
And her other question, Robin, was how Kavanaugh might rule on his tax returns. And of course, that was ruled on by a lower court federal judge just this week here in New York, rejecting the premise from Trump that not only can he not be indicted, he can't even be investigated while he's president of the United States.
Again, I would say that generally Justice Kavanaugh's history speaks to an approach which is a letter to the letter of the law. He is a strict constructionist. That is going to be his approach, I think, to any case. Sometimes it's going to politically fall on the side of the left and sometimes on the side of the right. In the case of the taxes, that's also remains to be seen.
The new book is called The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, an investigation. Please thank New York Times correspondents Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly for coming to the Green Space today. Thank you so much.